Hi, thanks for coming to the channel. So recently I've been noticing some memes and you get these little, I guess you would call them charts or little picture type memes. I don't really know if they can be strictly classified as memes, but they are usually based on comparisons between one thing and another. Often this is between countries in terms of geopolitical disputes. Um, But one that I've noticed a lot of late is from Muslims or people who I assume are either converts or being very naive, in my opinion, and they sort of draw these equivalencies, which in my view are false equivalencies. So I want to address a few of these. Um, to be honest, any one of these things could probably make a video in its own right, but I'll quickly or briefly rather outlay some of the issues here and why I think it's so contentious. um, because I think it's presenting a false picture. So one that I've seen today was a picture of two women. One of them was a Christian nun, an older woman who was a Christian nun. The other was a younger Muslim woman wearing the hijab. Um, and the caption read something like, "If this image doesn't concern you, but this one does, then you're just showing your bigotry." That's not verbatim, but it was along those lines. So, in other words, it's saying that there's no difference between a Christian nun wearing a head covering. Um, I'm not sure what the formal name for that would be. I guess it depends on the order. But, saying that's just the same thing as a Muslim woman wearing a hijab. Now, this is a good example of false equivalency, and this is why. The number of Christian nuns in Western countries, I'm using Western here in a sort of generic sense. Let's just say non-Islamic countries in the West, you know, United Kingdom, Canada, United States, France, Australia, if we're talking about Western culture, etc. The number of Christian nuns are going to be a very, very, very small percentage of women in the West. A very small percentage. I don't know what the figures would be. Might be a bit higher in more Catholic countries like Italy and Spain, but generally speaking, they're going to be a very small minority of women. That's important because that immediately sets it apart from a situation like Iran, where the average woman, regardless of her profession, has to wear a hijab. She has to cover up. And those who say, oh, they have a choice, are just being disingenuous. Consider a few years ago when there was protests in Tehran and elsewhere, you had a situation where some very brave women, most of them young women, some of them I imagine a bit older, were risking arrest or beatings for publicly removing their headscarves. In one case, a very brave young woman done this publicly. Now, that is brave because they know that they're risking arrest or beatings for doing so. But it also demonstrates that the fact that that is such a risk, it is imposed. It is imposed by the morality police. And here's the thing when it comes to the headscarf debate that's often overlooked. Those who say, oh, it's just about free choice, women should be able to wear what they want. Okay, that's on the surface, that sounds like a fair argument. But when you strip it back a bit, there's some troubling doctrines within that because it's based on modesty. So the implication is a woman who wears a hijab or a niqab or a burqa, taking it to more extreme levels, they're modest, but a woman who doesn't wear it is somehow not. So it's actually stigmatizing women who choose not to wear it, if indeed they have a choice. Which I think, like I said, in cases like Iran and Saudi Arabia, they don't. They really don't. Or if there's a choice, it's a very restricted one. So when I see people trying to make these comparisons, they tend to be Muslims who are basically just serving as propagandists for their religion because they want to say, oh, why is there these double standards? Except it isn't double standards, because a Christian nun is not the average Western woman. She's a very, very small minority and she is doing it by choice. That really is choice. Some might say, well, why are monks and priests not? obliged to do that. Okay, you can have a debate around that. But they have a certain dress code as well. Um, but it's just utter false equivalency. Now, again, I can make a whole video just on the headscarf issue. People might say, well, I'm a man, why should I comment on it? The answer to that is because it taps into a wider social issue. As a man, I've no interest in telling women what to wear, particularly, but I do think that when you get into areas like the niqab and the burqa, I would say this: a woman who chooses to wear those things in London or Ottawa or Sydney or Paris, it may be her choice, but she, in my opinion, is choosing to deliberately isolate herself from a Western society. In fact, in France, there are rules about it, and that's been very contentious. You get the likes of Erdogan in Turkey and Imran Khan in Pakistan claiming that France is Islamophobic as a result. But, talking of double standards, why should non-Muslim Western women be forced to cover up when they travel to the Gulf states as tourists if they want to enter a religious building? But, it's Islamophobic when a country like France has its rules. I'm not saying I entirely agree with the French rules, but I just think it is grotesque to try and set the same situation. Muslim women in France are not persecuted in the way that non-Muslims are in Islamic theocracies. They're just not. This is a totally false equivalency. I'm not saying, excuse me, I'm not saying there aren't examples of perhaps hate crimes happening, but in Western countries, hate crimes are indeed a crime and they're taken seriously. It does happen, unfortunately. I've heard those cases of Muslim women having their hijab ripped off by ignorant yobs. That's awful. No one should have to go through that, and I thoroughly condemn it, and I hope the perpetrators are arrested for assault. It's also cowardly targeting women in that way. But I find it very frustrating that we see these false equivalencies and people lap them up without really thinking about it. So there's other false equivalencies. The whole headscarf thing can be a whole debate in itself. By the way, just for the record, I have a neighbor who is a hijabi. She's a devout Muslim. She wears a hijab. A while back, when my father was not well, she knocked on the door, and it was a bit of a surprise because we rarely ever talk simply because it's been a while since we've been in touch. And she's a neighbor; she's on the same street. But she gave me some. She was just asking how I was, and she gave me some fruit. I thought that was very kind of her, and I thanked her. And if there was ever a situation where someone gave her a hard time because she wears a hijab, I would defend her as a neighbor and as a human being. So, I don't have a fundamental animosity towards women who wear the hijab. I say, yes, that is their choice. I do say that the burqa and the niqab, when it's a question of choice, is a question of isolation, far more so than the hijab. The hijab doesn't present communication problems in the same way. And people might want to follow up and say, oh, but Nathan, what about face masks during the pandemic? It's a different thing. That's due to health reasons, right? It's due to a pandemic. It's due to a unique situation, and it will not be permanent. When someone chooses to wear the niqab or the burqa in the West, it might technically be their choice, but I do think that is a statement of isolation. That's a statement saying we don't want to integrate. I think that's a problem. Um, the hijab, I don't think is such an issue because it doesn't have that communication problem in the same way. And for obvious reasons, in airports and train stations, there have been examples where male terrorists have hidden behind burqas. So there's a lot of factors in that mean it isn't a straightforward situation. But getting back to the point about false equivalency, another one that I've seen is when an atrocity occurs and the perpetrator is a white guy, we always see, or a white guy or a non-Muslim, we always see these memes saying, oh, why is the media not calling him a terrorist? And then they point to examples of Islamist attacks and saying, well, that's called terrorism. Here's the thing about terrorism, and this is something people need to understand. Not every act of violence is terrorism by definition. It might be terrorism to the victims, of course. Someone who is involved in a mass murder as a victim if they survive, it's going to make no difference to them whether the perpetrator was ISIS or a lone nut. Okay, they're still going to be a victim. So in that sense, all acts of violence are terror. But it is very, very important to understand this. To be classed as terrorism, there needs to be a political motivation. That's different from, say, a spree shooting in the United States where someone has just fallen out with their work colleagues and they're bitter, or they've had an argument with a family member and, they have an easy access to a firearm and they've went on a rampage. That's very different from an ideological attack where you're killing strangers. So I saw this with the recent Plymouth mass shooting in the UK. Now, there might be an argument that that should be classed as a terror attack because it was motivated by an ideology, supposedly this incel group that the guy was involved in. But again, that's a grey area because one of his victims was his own mother. It seemed like he knew at least some of his victims. That's different from a jihadist attack where generally the perpetrator doesn't know their victims. Um, but in terms of, oh, it's only Muslims called terrorists, that isn't actually true anyway. Um, You can look at numerous attacks in recent years that have been labelled terrorist. Brenton Tarrant, when the Christchurch mosque was attacked, that was widely called a terrorist attack, and non-Muslims, myself included, thoroughly condemned it. So, frankly, those Muslims who have a chip on their shoulder and say, "Oh, it's only called terrorism when Muslims do it," that's factually wrong. That's not the case. Another example: Anders Breivik in Norway. He is widely described as a terrorist because he committed an act of violence due to ideological reasons. He's a terrorist. In his case, he's a far right terrorist. Timothy McVeigh in the United States, the Oklahoma City bomber, is a terrorist. He's not a Muslim. So let's just drop this notion that only Muslims are called terrorists. It just so happens that at this time, probably most Muslims are terrorists because there is an ideological violence with pan Islamism that is on a unique scale compared to extremists in other religions. Because whilst you get Hindutva extremists in India, I'm sure you get Jewish extremists in Israel, and you get Buddhist extremists in Southeast Asia. They tend to be restricted to within those geographies. You even get Christian extremists like the Westboro Baptist Church and so on. But I argue that pan Islamism is unique. It is unique in its scale. Um, So again, when we're talking about violence, there's false equivalency to say, "Oh, well, only the Muslims are called terrorists." That is not true. Um, but you get another one, and this is perhaps the most galling of all. You may have come across a list which said Muslims did not cause World War Two, Muslims did not cause World War One, Muslims did not cause the slave trade. It goes through all these historic atrocities and terrible things. Muslims did not cause the Rwandan genocide, on and on and on. So the idea here is, oh, why are the Muslims being criticized? Well, on the surface, again, you could say, well, yeah, that's true. They didn't cause those things. But again, this is false equivalency because it's trying to say that because Muslims were not responsible for World War Two or World War One or the transatlantic slave trade or other such terrible events in history, Spanish Inquisition, you name it, then somehow they're innocent. Only one problem with that. It utterly ignores the Arab slave trade. It utterly ignores the violent early Islamic conquests, including the extremely bloody conquest of India, what's now the Indian subcontinent. Um, so this notion that Islam has a peaceful history is an utter, utter lie. It's just a lie. The Prophet was a warlord. He was a man of the sword. This idea that he was peaceful is just nonsense. Even most honest Muslims will acknowledge that. So when you get this list saying that Muslims were not responsible for this or this or this, okay, you can say that, but don't then imply, therefore, they have no blood on their hands. There isn't a major faith on this earth that doesn't have blood on its hands. Christianity is drenched in blood. Hinduism has blood on its hands. Judaism has blood on its hands. Even Sikhism, which is often seen as peaceful, there were examples of Sikh extremists. In fact, Ireland's worst terror attack was the Air India flight that was shot down over the Atlantic. That was Sikh extremists responsible, 1985, I believe, Buddhist extremists in Southeast Asia. So there isn't a religion that can claim to be squeaky clean when it comes to violence, not one. But Islam, I think, uniquely goes out of its way to say it's peaceful and tolerant, when it really, really isn't. The historic reality, you cannot argue with facts, you cannot argue with empirical truth. So all of these things, I think, is an attempt by propagandists to basically deflect legitimate criticism of Islam, and there's probably other examples. But I am so, so tired of these false equivalencies because they're designed to appeal to naive people, to politically correct people, to woke activists in the West who want to feel virtuous by saying, "Oh, but the Muslims are victims." There are examples of hate crimes happening against Muslims. I get that there's examples of mosques being vandalized, and extreme cases you get like the Christchurch bombing, but they are extreme cases, relatively speaking. There is simply no comparison between Muslims living in Western countries versus non-Muslims living under Islamic jurisdiction. There is no comparison. And with one or two exceptions, I'm thinking of Tunisia and perhaps a couple of others, almost without exception, Islamic majority countries have serious issues in terms of their treatment of minorities, almost without exception. Like I say, Tunisia would be one of the better examples. But look at Pakistan. All it takes is a minor, minor misunderstanding, and you have a lynch mob wanting to kill someone over alleged blasphemy. And this is not a rare occurrence. It happens far too often. Then you have Imran Khan pandering to Islamists, whilst he has the arrogance to lecture Western countries. So why does all of this matter? It matters because when you're simply seeing this false equivalency being allowed to be thrown out there without challenge, it becomes a problem. It brainwashes people. And I think it is one of those tools that end up radicalizing young men and in some cases young women to the Islamist cause because they're fed into this lie that they are victims. They're not victims. They're not victims. I mean, this is an incredible thing. For all the disparaging rhetoric that you get from Islamists about the West, it's interesting, isn't it, that you get Muslims who want to come to Western countries. I mean, how many Christians or Hindus or Sikhs would really, really want to live in an Islamic majority country? They might be okay to visit it, but how many people would really want to live under that sort of jurisdiction? So I really think that these false equivalencies need to be robustly challenged because they're based on lies and distortions and cherry picking of information. The issue about headscarves is an example. Saying that Muslim women in the West make a choice doesn't change the fact that for many women under Islamic theocracies, they really, really don't have a choice. And I think it is insulting their struggling to try and downplay that. So false equivalencies must be challenged because they are false and they're a powerful tool in propaganda. And that matters because it then radicalizes young people to believe the world out against them when it's really not.